Recognizing the Leader of the Third Party.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Honourable Speaker, I move that Bill M225 be now read a second time. It gives me great pleasure to rise and speak at second reading to Bill M225, the Ukrainian Famine and Genocide Holodomor Memorial Day Act. As I noted upon introducing the bill at first reading, the term Holodomor is derived from the words morite Holodom, meaning extermination by hunger. During Holodomor, between 3 and 5 million Ukrainians died as a result of a deliberate and politically motivated famine in 1932 to 33. This bill, if passed, would allow the fourth Saturday in November to be memorialized by the legislature as Ukrainian Famine and Genocide Holodomor Memorial Day. Canada is home to the world's third largest Ukrainian population behind Ukraine and Russia, with an estimated 1.36 million Ukrainian Canadians living across the country, and among them are members of my family. Please let me expand upon the importance of memorializing this horrific tragedy through the narrative of my own family's experiences in the Ukraine. I'm profoundly grateful, Honourable Speaker, to my uncle, Bogdan Kravchenko, who was born in December 1946, shortly after the Second World War, in a refugee camp in the American zone of southern Germany, for helping me with our family's history during and after and before the Holodomor. Tiako Bogdan was director of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Alberta for many years before moving to the Ukraine in 1991. There he became Director of Policy Studies at the Council of Advisors to the newly constituted Parliament of Ukraine after Ukraine declared its independence on August the 24th, 1991. Bogdan Kravchenko is presently the Dean of the Graduate School of Development at the University of Central Asia in Kyrgyzstan, where he also served as Director General from 2007 to 2014. Honourable Speaker, my grandfather on my mother's side, Alexander Kravchenko, immigrated to Canada in late 1950, arriving in Montreal with $5 in his pocket and with a family of 4 waiting in France to join him. Within a half a year or so, being a good welder, and I'll come back to that, he had saved up enough money to pay for the transatlantic passage that brought everyone, including my mother, to Montreal. Born in a small village in Dnepropetrovsk, eastern Ukraine in 1914, he survived the offensives and counter-offensives during the 1917-20 Ukrainian Revolution, the Stalin collectivization, the famine, repressions, and the horrors of the Second World War. He often reminded his children, including my mother, that he was one of the fortunate ones. Most people like him didn't make it. The Soviet regime was not established in Ukraine until 1919 after 3 attempts. At the end of 1918, the Bolshevik Party in Ukraine had only 5,000 members in a country of 29 million people, and Soviet power depended entirely on Red Army forces from Russia. In 1919, the Bolsheviks implemented devastating agricultural policies of collectivization and forceful grain requisitions that led to the 1921 famine that claimed the lives of 1 million people and proved to be a dress rehearsal for a far more ominous famine a decade later. It implemented the new economic policy in 1921, NEP, as it's popularly called, a more market-oriented economic policy to foster economic growth. That allowed private individuals to own small enterprises, but its biggest impact was on the countryside, abandoning the much-hated collectivization and allowing private holdings, including a relatively sane tax policy, instead of forceful confiscation. Agriculture production increased 70% of peasants were members of cooperatives. There were huge leaps in educational achievement, the urban economy expanded, and the Ukrainian countryside had one of the world's highest birth rates. All of this came to an end when Stalin decided on rapid industrialization that meant forced collectivization. That is, the abolition of private holding and forcing peasants into state-controlled collective farms for the simple reason that it was easier this way to extract enormous surpluses through outright confiscation. Honourable Speaker, the fact that agricultural production plunged was not at issue as long as the surpluses could be extracted. I should note as a little sidebar here that this same catastrophic policy was also pursued by Mao Zedong, Stalin's disciple in the Great Leap Forward. from 1957 to 60 that resulted in 30 million deaths in China. The country, in China that is, recovered under Deng Xiaoping, who was also greatly influenced by the experience of the new economic policy, the NEP, in his reforms built on out in Ukraine. Ukraine was always viewed by the Russian Bolsheviks as something of an El Dorado, with its rich black soil whose agricultural produce was there for the taking. But it had a troublesome peasantry, with its strong self-organization, village committees, cooperatives, and so on, that also served as a social base of the national idea. If only it could be brought to heel, broken, then the rapacious policies would encounter little resistance. My great-grandfather, Ustim Kravchenko, was part of the large base of the natural leadership of village society that had to be removed. He had seen the world, having sailed some 20,000 nautical miles as an army conscript, from Petersburg around the Cape of Good Hope to the land in the Far East to participate in one of the last battles of the 1905 Russo-Japanese War. He was stirred by the Ukrainian Revolution, and during the 1920s, under the new economic plan, he was active in village life, and in 1925, a founder of the Village Improvement Society from his village. There were 9 children in his family, and the parents scrimped to send the eldest 3 boys to institutions of higher education. The family was sustained by a farm of some 5 hectares. As Stalin moved towards collectivization in 1927, there was a large tax increase on the middle and high-income peasants. The vast majority of peasants in Ukraine were middle peasants, holding somewhere between 4 and 7 hectares of land. That year, at a meeting of the village council, recalling that at this time these councils played a very significant role in the governing of villages, Ustim criticized this measure, arguing that would lower incentives of peasant households to generate surpluses. The village council supported his position and voted against the tax increase. A few days later, Soviet security services arrested him, and he spent half a year in prison. Ustim was released in May 1928, the year Stalin declared industrialization and the first step of collectivization. The onslaught of the Ukrainian peasantry began with the so-called dekulakization campaign that involved ridding the countryside of its most productive strata and its natural leadership. The aim was, and I quote, the liquidation of kulaks as a class. Their property was to be confiscated, and one group was to be imprisoned in concentration camps or shot. The other deported to Siberia or northern Russia, and the third resettled in another location. My family fell in the second category. On March the 5th, 1930, a dekulakization brigade comprising party activists, the OGPU, that's the forerunner of the KGB, and urban residents descended on the village and ordered the family out of the house and took them to be loaded on a crowded cattle wagon headed for the woodlands of northern Russia, the Vologda region. Aboard was Ustim, age 50, his wife 41, and 5 of the youngest of the 9 children who were at home at the time. My grandfather, Alexander, who was 15, and four girls, aged 11, twins aged 8, and a 5-year-old. After some 2 weeks on the cattle wagon, Honorable Speaker, they were deposited in Vologda, where it was still winter. Women and children were separated from able-bodied men and herded into a church. Conditions were appalling. There was 1 loaf of bread for 18 people. Children started to die en masse. The mortality rate was so high that the camp commander petitioned authorities to allow children under the age of 15 to be sent to their relatives and friends. The 4 girls, my great aunts, the eldest being 11, were put on a train alone and sent to Dnepropetrovsk in Ukraine into the care of one of their elder brothers, my great-uncle, Dyako Vasil, a 21-year-old engineering student at the time. Ustim, their father, was driven into the woods to work to fell trees. It was winter, and he was half barefooted since his boots were torn and there were only 1 pair. In a letter to Vasil, he wrote, and I quote, "We are doomed here to a gradual death from starvation. We are told here that a bullet is worth more than any one of us, the exiled. So you altogether must take care of your sisters and brothers to save them and lead them on the path that your parents put you on. I myself am destined to find a grave in the woods of Vologda Governorate." He quoted a poem written by one of his fellow exiles from the Odessa region of the Ukraine. "When I remember Ukraine, my heart sinks. Cry, children of Ukraine, grow up in tears, and one day we will cry and sing and rejoice together." As a side note, in 1930, before the fully blown apparatus of repression was established, people wrote these letters where they expressed themselves in a manner that would be simply unthinkable a few years later. My great-uncle Vasil collected 22 such letters he received from various members of our family, burning the originals after transcribing them into school notebooks. He clung to them when the Germans took him from Ukraine during the Second World War as forced labor, where he remained after the war. My grandfather and his mother escaped the Vologda region. With the young girls gone, the authorities decided to move them to where the men were working in the woods. There was no place to live, no food, and they lived on the street. There was only one way out: to flee. It was an epic journey of almost 1,500 kilometers. My grandfather was 15 years old as he wrote in a letter to his brother Vasil, "If a runaway is caught, he or she is arrested. A Ukrainian is easily distinguished from a Russian. I learnt to speak their tongue and got a Russian jacket and dressed mother in a Russian sarafan," which is the national dress. His mother had to pretend to be deaf and dumb since she didn't know Russian. They slept in the woods or haylofts and begged for food. There was a dramatic moment on the journey when they reached the river Sukona that they had to cross. As they waited, as grandfather wrote, and I quote, "The militia came, they sat in the boat, and I pleaded them to take us across. I thought we were caught, but they only asked," and I quote, "Where are you going?" "To work," I said, and they didn't react at all. By the end of 1930, they made it to Ukraine, to Vasil's cramped quarters, and my grandfather was about to turn 16. Imagine that. He was just 15 when he made the 1,500 trek on foot with his mother. 1,500-kilometer trek on foot. They couldn't stay in Dnipropetrovsk as escapees. They would be punished. My grandfather did what thousands of other runaways did. He fled to the eastern cities of Ukraine, where industrialization created a massive demand for labor. The industrial centers were a cauldron. You could lie about where you came from, and in this period, there was no way authorities could quickly verify the information. He worked on a massive construction site, the building of the Dnipro hydroelectric dam, just outside Zaporizhia, carrying heavy drills up scaffolding at the age of 16. Then he moved deeper into the industrial heartland, Donetsk Oblast, changing jobs if it looked like the truth would emerge that he had fled exile. My grandfather excelled at welding. He visited nearby Berdyansk, a town by the sea where he met my Baba Antonina, whose family were rooted city dwellers with their own house, and she worked in an office at an enterprise and was quite adept at getting him various identity papers. They married, and he was 20 and she was 18. 1 year later, my uncle Oleg was born in Donetsk, and my mother, 4 years later, Ludmila, in Berdyansk. The town had several machine building plants, and there they lived until the middle of the Second World War. The rest of the family by now was scattered, the elder sister in one place, the young girls and mother either together with one of their brothers or other relatives. One brother, who was a land surveyor, even spent a short time in Tajikistan, but his team fortunately did make it back to Ukraine. He, quote, broke away, as one of the brothers wrote in a letter, meandered to Kazan, capital of Tatarstan, found work in Stalingrad and moved to Donetsk. Ustim, my great-grandfather, died in 1951, far away from the Vologda forests. After the Second World War, Honorable Speaker, he and his wife moved to Truskovets, Lviv Oblast, in western Ukraine, where he worked building wells in the town of Spaz. It's a cruel twist of fate, Honorable Speaker, that those such as my grandfather's family, who were exiled to northern Russia or Siberia for their resistance to collectivization and not allowed to return to their village, survived the 1930s because of this. For what unfolded in the Ukrainian villages was horrific. Collectivization was accelerated in the winter of 1930 to 31, and there was large-scale resistance. Revolts and uprisings broke out in many villages. Peasants slaughtered cattle rather than turn them over to collective farms. Draconian grain requisition quotas were set that included the confiscation of seed grain. And by early 1933, Honourable Speaker, the average peasant family, comprising 5 or 6 people, was left with 80 kilograms of grain to feed themselves. Peasants were forbidden to leave collective farms, and the Ukrainian borders were closely patrolled to prevent the starving to search for bread in neighboring Russia. One of the worst famines in Ukrainian history that killed millions ravaged Ukraine, the Holodomor. It is one that could have been totally avoided. Collectivization and the famine genocide of 1932 to 33 destroyed the peasants of Ukraine as a social stratum. The Ukrainian village was silenced and never again rose in opposition to the Soviet regime. Ukraine had not recovered from the traumas of the 1930s, when it was plunged into the cauldron of the Second World War. It was the largest Soviet republic which the Germans occupied in full, and armies swept through it not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times. The Nazi invasion and the Soviet army retreat that involved a scorched earth policy, destroying all that could not be evacuated, and included the execution of inmates in the NKVD prisons. That's what the secret police had called them. The German retreat that left yet another trail of destruction, and the retaking of the country by the Soviet forces. Not once, but twice, the mere fact that my grandfather was a welder saved his life and the lives of his family. Forced labor, some more often called slave labor, work camps were the destination for my family. The war was characterized by unheard of brutalities outside the field of battle. During the occupation, some 5 million civilians were killed, of whom over 600,000 were Jews. 1.4 million military personnel either perished on the fronts or died as prisoners of war. Every 3rd man in the Red Army was lost, compared to 1 in every 20 in the British Army. Altogether, 6.8 million people and 2 million citizens of the Republic were sent to Germany as Ostarbeiter, forced labor. Stalin's appalling unpreparedness to fight the war has been well documented, Honourable Speaker. He pinned all his hopes on the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The Germans invaded the USSR on June the 22nd, 1941. By October, Donetsk Oblast was taken. They confronted an army that was poorly led during the 1936 to 38 purges. 60% of army commanders from the corps to brigade level had either been executed or died in prison camps. The dispirited troops were quickly encircled and surrendered, only to die as prisoners of war. My grandfather, Alexander, was in the Donetsk region digging anti-tank ditches when the German army and the German war machine shattered the Soviet army. He survived and walked to Berdyansk, where his family lived. Once he told my uncle Bogdan about his experience. He straggled through battlefields with thousands upon thousands of corpses strewn across the landscape, with wounded soldiers in agony breathing their last breath. He arrived in Berdyansk, bedraggled, emaciated, and in shock. While he knocked on the door, his wife did not recognize him. My grandfather, like others, did not know what to expect. His brother Vasil, the engineer, and 3 of the elder girls had already been taken by Germans as Ostarbeiter. When it became known that the German advance in Russia was stopped and they would retreat in the face of superior Soviet forces, my grandfather knew that the steppes of Ukraine would once more become a bloody battlefield. So he loaded the family on a wagon. He was just 28, his wife 26, with 2 children, my uncle, who was 7, that's Uncle Oleg, and my mother, just 2 years old. And with a cow in tow, said goodbye to his parents, promising to return soon, and headed to no particular destination, just west, somewhere out of the way, spot so that the fronts coming to and fro would pass. My grandfather's welding skills provided the livelihood as they meandered and ended up in Slovakia. There, the Germans took them as forced labor. My grandfather to work repairing rail cars, and my grandmother as a highly exploited agricultural laborer with 2 children to take care of. The end of the war found them in the American zone of southern Germany. Otherwise, they would have been sent back to Ukraine, as 3 of his sisters were. From Germany, they moved to France and then to Canada. When the casualties of the revolutionary period, collectivization, famine, the purges, and the Second World are combined, more than half of the men and a quarter of the female population of the Ukraine perished. The survival rate of those who had been marked as enemies of the people was even lower. My grandfather was indeed one of the fortunate ones. It's hard to believe, one of the fortunate ones. He did return to the Ukraine, by then in retirement after his wife, my Baba, had died. He completed a theological degree at the Ukrainian Orthodox St. Andrew's College Faculty of Theology at the University of Manitoba and became an Orthodox priest. And with his eldest son, Dyako Oleg, also an Orthodox priest, they visited the native village and held a memorial service, Honourable Speaker, for all of the departed souls from his family, my family, and the rest in Ukraine. That, Honourable Speaker, is my family's story before, during, and after the Holodomor. And my family is only one of millions of Ukrainians who experienced the same. Through the passage of this bill, as has been done in the federal parliament, as well as the provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec, we say that we remember and that we memorialize the memory of the millions who died in Holodomor. Today, we can only imagine the atrocities experienced by the people of Ukraine. And while our memories fade with time, let us collectively say, never again.